Here. Welcome, everybody. Uh, Last I checked, it's Thursday, February the 8th of 2024. I haven't, in at least a little while, flubbed up and called it 2023 yet, again. So I'm going to try to keep my streak alive. Todd Tomlik, Lauren Kenny, thank you so much for joining me today on this webinar series. We'll get into some proper introductions here in a minute.
And we are streaming. So Derek, I'm going mute. I'm going to start the recording when you tell me to. Give me a 3, 2, 1 start, and then you guys are on stage.
That's good. At 11:59, so you know how much I love to be a stickler for time. I'm going to give it, right. Oh, there it hit, 12 o'clock Central. 3, 2, 1. Welcome, everybody. My name is Derek Johnson, captain of the ship here at Aurora WDC, and thank you for joining me once again in this monthly webinar series that I started a few months ago. It's Thursday, February 8th, 2024. Doesn't seem possible that Christmas and the New Year's holiday was already 6 or so weeks ago, but that just proves how fast time flies when we're having fun. Today's topic, this is technically topic number 3 in the 12 application priorities of competitive intelligence series. It may only be February. We started that in December if you're trying to do the math. So stack up to stand out. And what this topic is really all about is an opportunity to share with you some thoughts, not only around how to conduct operational and performance benchmarking against competitors, but even just as importantly, with a little more of the angle today taken toward how to communicate those results to the people that are important to you, your stakeholders, executive leadership, operations directors, and so on. That's going to be our mission for today, and I've asked 2 of my good friends if they would come along with me for this ride. We have Miss Lauren Kenny serving as our play-by-play analyst, coming to us from the area of Tampa, Florida, I believe. Lauren, welcome. Thank you for being here. Would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, Derek, thanks for having me. Looking forward to today's session.
And an old friend of mine, I'm not calling you old, by the way, Todd, when I say it that way, but an old friend. We've known each other for a while. Mr. Todd Tomlik, hailing from the Green Bay, Wisconsin area. Do I have that right, at least directionally?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Great to see you again, Derek, and looking forward to the discussion.
Good. So you might ask yourself, why did I sign up to join this webinar today? Well, I have this operating hypothesis that if we as professionals don't support the improved execution, sales, product performance categories of any product or service that our company has as their mission, their mandate out there in the broader world. If we aren't doing that, even if we don't sit in a direct product management, marketing, or innovation role, we're sort of experiencing a missed opportunity. So I think that's a slightly long roundabout way of saying whether or not you sit in finance, supply chain, operations, product, obviously, in one way or another, we're all in it to win it in support of our company's products and services that help us as organizations achieve success. What I hope, what I'm setting as an expectation for what you might learn today, is to how to identify, in your organization, what are those comparative key metrics from an ops and performance point of view that will give you a chance to truly kind of stack up to stand out, if you will? Going back to that image of the rocks on the beach, what are those criteria? And what are those best metrics that are going to allow you to kind of understand, at least from a competitive and market share being awarded to you, what are those best criteria to use given the objectives of your business? And once you've identified those, how are you going to go about collecting and interpreting that data in order to recognize not only where you might be ahead, but where you might be experiencing some shortcomings from those performance gaps? As I said a minute ago, you can do all the best work in terms of collection, analysis, interpretation, but if you aren't effective at communicating those findings to organizational stakeholders and helping them really drive those appropriate responses and decisions to be made across the enterprise, you're only going to get a certain portion of the way there. So the communication aspect of this is something that I know my two analysts on the phone here on the bridge today are deeply passionate about. And then ultimately, I hope that these ideas give you some maybe infrastructure or structural components of how you might build an ongoing program like this for yourselves. Benchmarking is one of those topics that has a lot of different definitions for different people. I'm going to start with you, Lauren. Maybe take a second to introduce yourself, your background, and why this particular topic appealed to you when I came knocking to see if you'd be my analyst today.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Lauren Kenny here. I'm a program manager at Aurora WDC, and I've been with Aurora full-time for the last 5 years or so now, working with clients, particularly those in the healthcare and life sciences industries, to monitor competitors, but not only that, to identify competitors who are doing things well, and what we can learn from them or what gaps we might be able to fill based on positioning. And so I think, the idea of benchmarking here lends itself really well to that. You can know where your organization or your product line stands with respect to criteria that are important to you, as well as, within the broader competitive environment, and quickly understand where you're strong, where you might need to improve. And of course, communicating insights is really close to my heart. If a benchmark falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, right? What does that really mean? So looking forward to diving into that today.
Great, thank you. Lauren. Todd, please introduce yourself and maybe your background, why you agreed to my request a handful of weeks ago when I called you up.
Sure. Yeah. So Todd Tomalak from Zonda. I'm a principal at the firm. Just to give you a background on what we do. So essentially, we're a housing data and research firm. And all I do and our whole firm does is spend all of our time thinking about what's happening around housing and building products for North America, which is a huge industry. Think of like the Home Depots and Lowe's of the world, but all the companies that supply them. So I'm responsible for the thesis of what we think is going to happen for kind of the different components of the industry, how it's going to play out. We have a lot of investors that we work with. And the reason that I agreed to join Derek here today, apart from the fact that I think Derek is a great, thoughtful person, is that benchmarking turns out to be so important, especially for a lot of our investor clients. Think of like hedge funds that are trying to understand why is one company performing so grossly differently than another, and usually it comes down to some fundamental exposure or part of the market that they're tied to or performing differently in, that if you don't look closely gets lost in the weeds. So there's a whole lot of money attached to finding those little gems, and I have learned the hard way around how to communicate those, or how not to communicate those too. That's just as important. So it's a joy to be able to join Derek, and obviously we're old friends.
Yeah, right on. Well, thank you, Todd and Lauren. So, folks, there's a lot of different benchmarking sources that you have available to you. We're going to talk in a little while, maybe the second half of our webinar today, about information sources, and really what it breaks down to is those in the what we referred to, and I introduced this for the first time back in December with Danny LaFontaine on the play-by-play. You basically have 4 source categories, if you will, and we'll get into those here in a little bit. You have other sources available to you, so you can go to entities out there, the Global Benchmarking Network, the American Society for Quality. You can obviously, there's endless numbers of good books and texts on this particular topic of benchmarking. At the end of the day, you're going to have to, your best program is going to be one that works for you, and there's a lot of different variations of what that looks like. And we just hope to inspire some better thought processes, some maybe more creativity in terms of how you might go about that for your organizations today. Lauren, when you think about the benchmarking process and the way we've organized these slides, what is our audience kind of in store for? here over the next 30, 35 minutes.
Yeah, so imagine you're a marathon runner, right, who wants to improve their performance. You would probably look to other marathon runners to see what they're doing well and what you can learn from them. So not only do you need to take that first step to identify who is leading the pack, who's performing well in races, who's got the fastest time, you also want to understand what makes them so fast. Is it their training regimen, their gear, their strategies, some pacing? Similarly, in benchmarking, we're not just looking at the winners. So, first step is identifying who you're going to benchmark against and what criteria to benchmark for. But then the second piece is deciphering that winning formula, and that's going to depend on the information that you are collecting. So you want to make a plan for collection and analysis, and then compare your own performance against benchmarks. And the third phase is implementing. And effective implementation really requires three things. The first being stakeholder buy-in, which you want to get from the very beginning, clear communication of insights, and then ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So during this last phase, you should be working with stakeholders to develop practical and feasible action plans based on your benchmarking results. Todd, I'd love to hear from you, how you would define operational benchmarking and if there are any pieces of the process that are critical when we're talking about operations and performance.
Yeah, I mean, how we usually think about operational benchmarking is kind of all the traditional financial metrics that matter for like a manufacturing company. So those are the things that you care about measuring, but are usually hard to get your arms around your competitors. So years ago, I was at Kohler Company. We would spend a lot of time trying to think about just like how well is a particular product being executed, how is it being priced, where is it being sold to. None of those things are public data. So we would engage usually a competitive intel firm to help us figure out some of those pieces. But we would, of course, collect those internally and compare those, with whatever we're able to identify. What you'll see in one of the examples that we go through is sometimes what we find out as we begin kind of pulling the thread on operational benchmarking, that what we should be measuring turns out to be very different than what we assumed we should be measuring, and that changes kind of who we would benchmark against. But yeah, I'll turn it back over.
And as we think about that first step, the identification step, Lauren, there's a lot of different actors in your competitive ecosystem out there. Work us through on this slide just for kind of a little level setting on when we think about competition, we think about it in a little bit broader context, right?
Yeah, Derek, of course, we're coming at it from a competitive intelligence angle and competitive analysis. And this is a framework that we like to use regularly. It's called the 6 Angles Framework, and it uses 6 angles of competition to help us view business dynamics that affect how successfully our company can draw revenue and profits from buyers. So each angle is discussed according to its functional system, what it is, how it works, and its task for buyers. What job does it perform? What market does it serve? And so we think that this framework can help us consider the industry and market dynamics that will allow us to select either comparable or aspirational organizations for benchmarking. And to Todd's point, he alluded that one challenge in benchmarking could be over-reliance on direct competition or focusing in one particular area and not giving the attention to another. For example, certain industries tend to regularly benchmark against themselves using the same publicly available data. And as a result, they can start to look like each other and move together, which isn't always a bad thing. Certainly there are best practices, but consider whether those companies are benchmarking to be mediocre or to be great, and how could a company in that industry differentiate. So while it's important to monitor and track direct competition, we also want to help you today think about other potential benchmarks using these 6 angles. Todd, in your experience at Zonda, what factors do you consider when selecting benchmarking organizations?
Yeah, we try to get as close as we possibly can into understanding why why a product, if it's a product being sold or installed, what the story is on how come. And usually what we find is that the leaders at the company that manufacture that product maybe see about half of like what they think it's because it's related to an architect, or they think it's related to a builder, or they think it's related to like the price of their product, and all those things matter. But very often there's many other things that, like kind of as you allude to here, that also are influencing the process, that are totally either outside their control, or potential that are causing them to get maybe a very different sale than they expected. And what that means, that we'll show an example in a little bit, but generally what we try to do is we'll start with the end consumer as close as we can, and then trail back, which I know we're going to talk about the how in a little bit.
Nice. Obviously, with a publicly traded organization the size of Alphabet, there is endless data points out there. This has become the center image on the screen now, folks. Has become a kind of a standard fare, if you will, with companies that are such huge businesses with, in some cases, huge sub businesses within them. And then to be able to have an opportunity to look at where the revenue streams are coming all the way down to ultimately the profit side. Lauren, when you look at what, this is getting into the what you should benchmark. Work us through especially coming at it from a product marketing management innovation layer. What are those whats? What are those key topics that folks should be taking a look at?
Yeah, I'd say that the first step in selecting benchmark criteria is to ensure alignment with your organization's goals and objectives. And this goes to my point earlier about getting stakeholder buy-in from the beginning. And so making sure you're checking in with yourself about how do the selected benchmark criteria support your strategic priorities, competitive positioning, and overall goals that are aligned with leadership and your organization. But in terms of identifying what you should benchmark for, there are a couple things to keep in mind. The first being that scorecards or benchmarks can sometimes reflect only a point in time. So it's important to get a balance of, comparing points in time with rates or trends, right? If I go to the doctor and I get my blood pressure taken, that's a great snapshot of my current health status, but it doesn't really capture my overall health or any trends that might be happening over time that would allow me to detect issues early or adjust a treatment plan if I needed to. Another thing to keep in mind is considering a mix of leading and lagging indicators. Leading indicators can help us anticipate future performance, although they're sometimes less reliable. And lagging indicators can provide insights into past performance. For example, market share is a lagging indicator. It's historical performance relative to competitors. And it's important to monitor, right? It can help us identify opportunities, address competitive threats, and adjust our strategy. But an example of a leading indicator might be time to market for a new product, or number of leads and pipeline volume that could help us help signal what revenue, another lagging indicator, could be expected in the future. I have a question for Todd. When you're thinking about what you should be benchmarking, how do you prioritize performance metrics based on their importance to your organization?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story from the financial crisis, and I think this is a kind of a moment of truth for a lot of the companies that we work with. So if you think back to what happened during the financial crisis, we worked in a housing related industry that is centered around like the reason that there was fallout in the broader economy. So housing was cratering, things were a disaster. And I remember a very candid conversation with the CEO of that company, multi-billion-dollar company. And the direction was the entire scorecard we know is going to be a disaster. Revenue is going to decline. Margins are going to be, a bloodbath. We're going to see all sorts of things move around. But because we have very little debt, we're going to focus on market share. And that is going to be like the de facto scorecard that we're going to score at the very, very top. So that meant that as across the board, every other factor, we looked at net promoter, we looked at a whole bunch of these other potential factors, basically took like B or C tier to market share. And the rationale was that if you were in a down market winning market share, unit and dollar, it was a signal that all the other things were succeeding as best as they possibly could. And then when the market rebounded, that you'd be really well strategically positioned. Now that works great as long as you're defining your opportunity in your market right, and you're not being overly narrow, which is always the gamble. But that's kind of where I'd like to default to. So when we go to the Builders Show at the end of this month, one of the things I'll be kind of mentally going through is thinking about which of the companies that we're dealing with are most likely to gain or lose share over the next year because of things that we're seeing there do. So that's my bias towards the top. There's a whole case to be made that net promoter is most important, or a whole case to be made that other indicators matter more. But I think back to what happened during the financial crisis, that market share was one of the most useful, lagging, admittedly, but signals of where you want it to be strategically.
That's great. Moving on, we have all obviously started hearing. Maybe some of us are users or owners of these, Vision Pro virtual reality goggles. I happen to have one. I will admit I kind of can't stand it because it provides me this complete and utter disorientation experience that I'm not sure I'm ever going to get over. But when you think about consumer product examples of products with, heightening degrees of competition, there's certain performance metrics, that an Apple will look at specifically with regard to, this particular, Vision Pro headset, and things like NPS and sales velocity and ongoing demand are pretty obvious ones. Lauren and Todd, are you thinking about other metrics with this particular example as we kind of set the table for some other examples today? What other ones, if you're studying Apple, would you recommend the audience think about?
So I'll throw one out there. So and this is going to sound like a little bit of a rant, but I think it's correct. What tends to get measured, especially in old businesses, very successful businesses, is what's easy to measure. It's easy to measure revenue. It's easy to kind of we can do a survey around net promoter. All those things are kind of fairly easy to get together. For a product like this, though, what we're really probably trying to capture is change in consumer wallet, where we're swapping. Consumers only have so much money. There's only finite things they can spend on. Something else has to get swapped, unless they're purchasing on credit, which is just a change in time of what they're buying in the future versus now. So we like to start very, very broad and essentially understand if they were to buy a product like this, what is it displacing? And what that lets us do by starting like with a very broad market definition, it allows us to avoid the issue of like Blockbuster thinking they're beating Netflix because they've defined their market too narrowly. So for a product like this, the first part of the story would be an interview of all the consumers like Derek who bought a product like these as much as we could open-ended, and understand like how are you using it, and because you're using this, what are you using less of, and understood kind of what piece on the board you've now taken the place of.
Sure. Anything to add, Lauren? We should move on to our next one.
No, let's go ahead. I think that was great. And Derek, I'm right there with you. I don't think I'm necessarily going to be a customer. Anytime I've tried AR headsets, I've been ill.
Yeah, makes you physically ill. I don't think you're alone. Todd, I love that change in wallet. Kind of what are we deferring in order to move, to this next category? Really near and dear example to your heart, I know, Lauren, is this healthcare example. Let's work it through. What do you see?
Sure. Yeah, this is just another example thinking through those 6 angles and potential benchmarks, but also, to Todd's point, what are some of the other factors that we should be considering in the overall market environment? So you might be familiar with Omada. It's a digital care solution that offers programs like diabetes care management with a virtual first model. And just going around the horn, Omada is obviously going to be very interested in learning about its direct competition, including companies like Livongo by Teladoc, a very similar product doing the same task for the buyer, which in this case is an employer group or a plan sponsor. And against this direct competition, Omada is probably going to want to use any of the benchmark criteria on the right, but especially revenue, market share, to the extent that it can get to that with some of these companies being privately held. It may also benefit Omada to look at a company like Strive Health, which has a similar condition care management role, but with an alternative use for kidney care. And Omada could benchmark against Strive for criteria like member engagement and satisfaction, as well as like provider satisfaction, right? What's Strive doing well that Omada could learn from? A complement could be a company like Dexcom, which manufactures the continuous glucose monitors as part of programs like Omada. And then economic competition might be a GLP-1 therapy like Ozempic. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard of Ozempic and how it could potentially threaten a lot of different industries, like to Todd's point about wallet, like if a person is on Ozempic, right, are they using the same level of, fitness classes? Are they snacking as much as they were before? So all this can impact a variety of companies, including condition care companies like Omada. A buyer might include an employer group with a worksite clinic. So Omada might want to benchmark them for staffing mix, right? How are they using clinicians versus coaches, for example? Todd, Derek, any comments? Otherwise, I know, Todd, we're going to get to your example next.
That's a great example, Warren. Let's move on to Todd's.
Okay, so this is a building products, in industrial application example. So just to give you a sense of what we benchmarked, so we were looking at a potential acquisition for a target company, and very, very simple. All we did was we took the company's revenue, and because we've got really granular address level information about every home and country, we bumped up their individual ship to addresses against the actual homes that they ship to. So we all understand, like, when did people move in when they bought the products? How old was the home? Did they have children? All the kind of the demographic details that you'd be interested in. And one of the things that came out from this exercise was that if we took the paver industry, which is not a very exciting industry on paper, that this company that we were looking at just laid really different. So the typical paver industry has about 85% exposure volume to new construction, which is really cyclical. So when interest rates move up or when interest rates move down, we see these really big swings in top line and bottom line and all the other metrics that you'd benchmark. What we learned by getting as close to the end consumers as we possibly could. So this is a metric that would not show up in any like published census data. This would not show up in any obvious secondary data. You'd have to do some additional research on this. But what we learned was that this company had almost 5 times more exposure to existing homes. And the reason that matters is that the margins are higher. It's a lot more predictable revenue. It's worth like 2 to 3 times more if it was going to sell, to another buyer. So this is a diamond in the rough that we learned just by taking the initial question of like what age, what type of homes are these products being installed versus their peers. If we go to the next slide, so kind of as we pulled the thread on the story of this company, we have a service that what we do is we collect satellite imagery, and we use a lot of that in machine learning to like capture construction on properties as that's happening. And one of the things we learned, this is actually a real example of a real home, one of their customers who had installed their products. And one of the things we discovered was that the reason, especially during COVID, that this household installed pavers was because their neighbor had installed a pool like the year before. And the rest of the industry installed these pavers typically when the home was built. This was not the case. This home had been built beforehand. But we can see that their next door neighbor in the middle had built a home. And then at right, this is about 2 years later, this is their customer who had installed that home, built those products. And the reason this mattered is we learned that the entire selection of how they chose their products were by what their neighbor had recommended. So it became one more kind of layer of things that you'd want to influence if you're a marketer, that would be tough to measure if you had a traditional scorecard. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and then this is one other example. As we kind of pulled the thread more on the process of thinking about like shifting the wallet share around why a particular product was purchased. If you had to think about the competitive influences of why someone would choose something as simple as pavers, you might think about like color, prices, is it available? But one of the things that we uncovered, because we had really detailed data on the housing stock and these addresses, was just as homes get more expensive, you've seen what happened recently. You can't buy a home. There'd be people scampering to try to buy, any home that's available. And mortgage rates have increased pretty rapidly. That the density of how homes are built gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And so the reason that matters is what we learned was that byproduct of building homes really, really tightly meant that the design of the home has changed, and you inherently build homes with more patios in the backyard, which means that the economy can decline, housing starts can decline, but the attachment rate of how many patio pavers you use per home goes up just because they're building them more tightly. So this is a great example of just in order to get that sale, they ended up having to install like these weird rear sliding large format glass windows. You don't ever think of pavers having to be tacked next to a window as part of the sale. You would never list them as a competitive set. But for these customers, they were. You had to have both of them. So it just uncovered more about the story about why people were purchasing and that this was much more persistent than we might have otherwise guessed. And the only way to get there was by really unraveling the story of, with a lot of data about why each home was installing these products.
That's really a fascinating example, and thank you for sharing it, Todd. Lauren, before we move on, anything to add? We good? Going?
Great. Such a great example and so relatable.
So I'm seeing Gary's and Alan's requests for data sources, and an ethical illustration of them obviously is what everybody's out for. I alluded to this in the early part of today's presentation that really there are four, in our opinion, from a competitive intelligence point of view, there's four different source layers that y'all can kind of tap into. There's kind of that standard open source. This would imagine being, those things that are a little more automated, from a collection, curation, delivery point of view. Might even be some of what you were talking about, Todd, and the machine learning satellite imagery. It's not as though you're doing a call for those. You're setting up it might be advanced, but it's truly an open source, even if it is despite licensed and proprietary software. You're doing that in a more standardized fashion. Then of course you're getting into opportunities, right, Lauren, where you can go really advanced open source, requiring a level of creativity and skill at the desk research level. Anything to add about that? I know we're going to get into some examples here in a minute, but Lauren, anything on that top left quadrant?
Yeah, I mean, advanced OSINT does require a little bit more creativity. I'd say that a specialized database might also fall into that category and could be something that you might want to look into. Arguably, like analyzing raw data, like data, if anyone's ever worked with data from Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, right? There's a lot of processing that has to happen there. So I think that could fall into that category as well. But there's a lot of insight that can be gleaned from information from data like that.
If you think about that left-hand part of the screen, we're going to give you specific examples here in a minute. Being that kind of OSINT level, I will self-admit that I'm biased toward the human intel angle. Maybe that's my extrovert coming out. Maybe it's just the fact that where I think the real yield with intelligence is that kind of differentiable yield that you can have is going to come through human interaction and the intellect of human beings being able to provide something that is differentiated. One place to start then, of course, is internal human source knowledge. It's been said for a long time in our space that 80% of what you might need to know resides in the head of somebody inside your company. Your organization is acquiring sources, employees from competitors on the regular, other industry watchers, observers, analyst firms, what have you. And then that other kind of upper right one would be those external human sources, sources directly at a competitor. You may obviously not be able to do some of that yourself. You may have to have a partner do it, whether it be an independent researcher or going through the channels of customers and other partners who can help to inform your strategies. Todd and Warren, what do you think about that human side of it? And then we'll move on to the next slide with some specific examples.
In my view, you need them both, but the human really answers the why. So which matters so much more than what people realize, because a lot of times that motivation, we were working on a deal one time and we learned that one person was willing to lose money over time, something you never would have modeled, because they were a family member to this other person and they hated the other person. You never would have, that would never show up in secondary data. You have to see an anomaly in the big data, and then you discover the why in the story with the human.
Lauren, should we
Derek,
move on to the next one? What do you think?
I was going to add that, I loved your point about how internal human sources can be a great way to get information. For example, leveraging your sales force. They interact with your customers every day, and they are a great source for competitive intelligence as well. For example, a technology startup's time to value being 12 weeks from signing the contract to adoption, to them leveraging the software where it's actually making an impact. By collecting competitive intelligence data through their sales force, that technology startup discovered that a competitor was claiming time to value of 6 weeks. And so that's compared to their 12. And that kind of sparked a big conversation, and that startup got really innovative and was able to reduce time to value to 2 weeks, figuring out how to be more efficient. So that's just one example of how internal human can drive improvements and drive action.
Then kind of moving along, we've given you all on this slide some examples of source types and key intelligence topics and questions that can kind of naturally align to those source layers inside and outside your organization. Also with that kind of open source angle to it on the far left. I know, Lauren, that we have, maybe for Gary and for Alan and others that might want this, I think we can go one step deeper with this slide. We have some resources that we're happy to share, that kind of give you some ideas for where to look for revenue and financials, particularly if you're dealing with privately held organizations. Same kind of deal, a little bit of shared expertise, that we're willing to provide to you all, in way of thinking about some of these other categories. When you look at this, Lauren, what kind of stands out to you? And I know we're going to get into a few specific stakeholder groups here in a little bit. What stands out to you? Obviously those that we've bolded in red would be ones that we want the audience to take notice of.
Yeah, you bring up a great point about like revenue and financial benchmarks, and for companies that are public and regularly report financials, it's going to be easy to access that. But if your competitors are private companies, it can be more difficult. You can get some of that through advanced open source intel. There may be databases that you can leverage, like PitchBook or other things that could help you get to some of those financials. It also may be worthwhile to pursue external humans. And I think there was a question earlier about, reliability of sources. And one thing we like to recommend is aiming for multi-source corroboration or triangulation, and sort of putting the pieces of the puzzle together if you can't directly access the information in an earnings report, for example.
Right on. I'm actually seeing Zahir in the chat says, in my view, the real fun starts when OSINT, the automated version, gets augmented by the desk side of OSINT, layering in some humans. So that heavy lifting versus more of an insights paradigm. It's a really great point that you make there, Zahir. When we think about how we can set up these structures and ultimately, once we get them at certain kind of levels and we want to level up our analysis, how might we go about that, Lauren? I think you have a couple of really great examples here on this slide for prioritizing those kind of areas of improvement.
Yeah, these are a couple of frameworks that you can use to help identify performance gaps. So the first step on the left being the market positioning map for categorizing performance. You've probably seen something that looks like this before, just helping to identify who the leaders, challengers, and followers or other niche players might be. And then you can take that a step further with the importance versus performance framework, also known as a prioritization or a gap analysis matrix. And you can start to pull out what are your strengths, where are areas for improvement, and then assessing resource allocation or strategy shifts based on the importance of those metrics. For example, while they're still strengths, if they rank low importance, they may not warrant significant attention compared to higher priority areas. And then in contrast, you'll see in yellow an area of low performance and low importance. So think about whether improving your performance in those areas would yield significant benefits. Is it a must-have that you're not delivering on, or is it a nice-to-have that you could maybe lean away from? Todd, what other analytical techniques do you use to interpret benchmark data and to identify gaps or opportunities?
Yeah, my general approach is we like to use this framework is absolutely the right framework. Well, what we try to do is explore anomalies that appear in this framework that shouldn't exist, and then see if we can investigate why. In a lot of instances, that's where the opportunity might lay too. So, for example, someone who is relatively high performance, but doesn't seem to be doing business the same way that you're doing. They're not engaging with clients the same way. They're not dealing with their customers the same way. We're seeing a big shift around like distribution, a lot of manufactured direct to consumer. So the way that they would benchmark themselves against, say, like traditional people who are using retailers would look totally different. If they're succeeding, it could be a broader story. So I would almost think about this quadrant as like a three-dimensional quadrant where you're looking for like any bizarre outliers that are growing and persistently there.
We got 12:41. We're going to save some time, everybody, with making sure that we get to some Q&A, some dedicated Q&A. We're taking a few questions as we come here. So let's talk about implement. And I think about communicate. The word communicate rises to the surface when I think about implement. You can do all the great analysis, ops, performance level benchmarking that you have time to do, but communicating that out to the right set of stakeholders is really the last stage of that process. Lauren, when you think about delivering these results, of your benchmarks, what are the kind of the main things that you always have to be aware of? What would you say?
Yeah, going back to stakeholder buy-in, you want to make sure you're understanding where your stakeholders are coming from, starting with your leadership and then, moving to the other areas of the business. So make sure that you're defining your purpose and your audience, and then choose the right format for presentation and discussion. Right form follows function. Regardless of who you're presenting to, visual aids and storytelling techniques can definitely enhance the impact of your presentation. And then making sure that you're following up and creating feedback loops when it comes to benchmarking is also important. Todd, is it important, and how often would you recommend revisiting benchmarking initiatives to make sure that you're checking in on progress and updating your criteria?
Well, I think it's super important. It depends on what's possible. So, in general, what we tend to see is most of the companies that are really focused on like benchmarking a few key indicators only really can afford to revisit the indicator as often as that they can like make a decision. And so that could be like deploying capital, developing a new product. they all want it very, very frequently because it makes them feel like they're watching it. But if they can't make the decision that often, our view is that it's far too expensive, and usually it's over measurement. We've seen that in a number of companies. So what that really means is, I think, this is, you might hate me for saying this, but I think like once every 2 years in a lot of instances is the right cadence, because it takes time to develop, to pull capital together, to actually execute on a plan, to know if it's working. There's a few things like sales and other things that you might want to revisit more often, but strategically, once every 2 years.
And who's going to care about this data, Lauren? I know we're going to isolate on maybe 2 or 3 of these categories of common stakeholders and their typical areas of focus. Which ones do you want to draw some attention to today?
Yeah, I think for this audience, it might make sense to linger on marketing and product, as well as executive leadership and operations, a few different areas of the business that would benefit from benchmarking insights. Any comments to start, Derek or Todd?
They certainly feel to me like really good ones to start with. What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, I think the top three, I would start there. It's gotta come from someone who can make a decision first, and everyone else has to. If they don't have their buy-in, it's hard to make any of the other pieces work. I have fumbled plenty of really important competitive, insights because of poor delivery, which is something I've had to develop later in my career. And I would say generally my career has advanced pretty significantly as I've been able to communicate more towards those top three, because then it's very practical and usable. So yeah, those would be the focus.
Yeah, I look at the top three really serving tactical success, which is obviously on everybody's mind. I'm not saying sales can't be strategic, but if you don't get tactical wins, through your sales channels, and BD is a really great kind of corollary to, in most cases, BD, at least in some walks of life, means M&A. I don't know that that's necessarily the specific use case we might mean here, but you're out there, you're building development, your channel resellers, et cetera, are obviously a sales question. I think of marketing and product. We talked about some of these metrics being lagging indicators versus leading indicators. Whichever is the case, use them as the indicators that they're capable of providing you those insights on. Ultimately, executive leadership, if you can take a program like this, around ops and performance level benchmarking, and develop some fans in the executive circles of your organization, that's going to give you more staying power. I like to use the term durability of your intel function. That opportunity to just be relevant, be sought after, doesn't mean you aren't going to have some friction, right, with those sources from time to time. And that friction concept can make people uncomfortable occasionally. But I'm a big believer in actively seeking out that friction, even if it means an uncomfortable conversation with a stakeholder from time to time. That ops layer, I really don't think that you can have effective, ops and performance level benchmarking without taking a really close examination into, things like cost structure, delivery efficiency. Obviously, that's going to depend on what type of product you're selling. If you're building products, channel, like Home Depot or Lowe's, delivery efficiency means something very different than, or in your example of reducing time to market value, in the software example, from 12 weeks to 6 to 2. But at the end of the day, you're operating more efficiently. You got to figure out what those right metrics are, right? I think.
Yeah, Derek, I think point, like friction isn't always bad, and you should seek that out. So one thing I'd call out is that in addition to meeting with and engaging with each individual stakeholder group, consider how you could also foster that discussion and collaboration, whether it's a workshop or some type of session to engage with different teams to interpret the findings and get to that actionable and feasible plan.
Right on. And then sometimes, you got to make this stuff visual. I think for me, that's where I've really loved watching you, Lauren, develop your skill set over the last 4 or 5 years. That visual execution on data. I know, Todd, you um, represent this statement well too. If you can't visually depict something, and I'm pretty awful at it, that's why I have good other people like Lauren around me. You have to be able to do that effectively, or you're going to lose stakeholders who, in the busyness of the business world, just don't have time to read 3 to 20-page dossiers with all the metrics and all the details. Some of them may still want that. You may come across extremely detailed executive leaders who want that also, but you got to be able to visually depict it quickly. Lauren, when you think about models like what we see here on the screen, what comes immediately to mind? Is it as hard as you think some on the line today might say, "Oh, I could never build something like that. I'm just not gifted in that way." Is it really that difficult?
No, there are a lot of tools that you can use, whether that's just building something in PowerPoint, or if you have, dashboards and a platform that you can leverage for accessing this information regularly, tailoring your display, applying filters and adjusting visuals with that platform. So I'd say it isn't so hard. The other thing I'd call out is that sometimes you don't always need a visual. So again, think about the form, think about your audience, and then you can figure out what you need to do in order to communicate insights. But we tell stories at the dinner table all the time, and they're impactful and they're interesting, and people take away a message. So I think if you're struggling a little bit with your visuals, really focus on building your story. If you are looking to build a slide or two, or even an in-depth document, right? Executives, you probably build a presentation, but a product team is going to want the details. These are a couple of options. A bullet chart is really common and can be useful for visualizing benchmarking data. It has your company performance and then the bands indicating the benchmark or the target, and you can layer on markers like comparative metrics or additional thresholds. You can get really creative.
Nice. Todd, when you look at this slide, what kind of immediately comes to mind?
So I feel like what we're always reaching for is to reduce as much as we possibly can the amount of time that it takes someone to be exposed to the concept and the data and to go, oh, I get it. So that digestion time. So visuals like that do that really intuitively. And what's nice is that you don't get too much focused on the definitions. All that is important and it's for the right audience. But for an executive, they need to be able to digest it really quickly. One last comment. Why have, I tell our team this all the time. If we think about the phenomenon of memes, why, dear Lord, why are memes so common? Why are they're funny, but the mental digestion period is so quick. You see an image, you see a one sentence and you get it and you forward it to someone else. So very fast mental digestion period, slides that allow someone to get it are the ones that tend to be forwarded by executive leadership. And those are the ones that get updated and requested to be updated again in the future and become benchmarks that you track over time.
They become kind of the fabric of what that executive leadership circle, what they continue to come back to, for sure. We're going to officially open the Q&A. We already have a number of really great questions. I'm going to go to one that Sarab put into the chat. What is the best way to visually present the benchmark data to customers? Any ideas? Todd, you look like you might want to jump in on that one.
So we've done a lot of benchmark. It depends who your customer is, but assuming it's someone in executive leadership, I think there's no substitute for color groupings. And I'm talking simple, red is bad, green is good. You know, as in a chart like this, you might have something like that shows very quickly like where they score. And the reason is because it's just so intuitive. You're not going to show that to engineers. You're not going to show that to other data scientists. But um, I there's a few different tools that are out there that you know can help with that. But color is underrated.
Lauren, see anything here that from a customer? I think my interpretation of what Saurabh might have been meaning would be end customer. So, you know, sometimes that's stakeholder if you're in an Intel function. Other times it's truly your end customer and being able to share some of that data with them. Also seeing Richard's comment about a tool called the competitive productivity tool or process. It's a good one to check out. As we get sort of wrapping up here, folks, for today's, I'm going to go to this, but and then I'm going to go broad screen again so that Lauren and Todd and I are not little icons in the background. You know, when you think about ways to do this, with this webinar comes a no strings attached access to me, to Lauren. I'm sure Todd's available, you know, as well. Anybody that has questions about things that we presented today, and you just want to talk about those things, whether it be source categories or communication strategies or other things. Open book, reach out, a lot of different ways to engage. We also provide as an organization training around these types of things. Again, I'm not here to sell you anything. We can talk about that whenever you're ready. If you're ever ready at all, just reach out and we are happy to engage. Obviously, Todd, you alluded to it, you know, as a competitive intel agency, we on more than an occasional basis, we get involved in this type of thing for our clients, new and old alike, who might be strapped for their own time, their own resources to be able to do this themselves, and they just simply need an agency partner to be able to do this for them. Certainly happy to talk about any and all of that. Again, I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm just here to provoke good ideas, maybe more creative thought processes for your intelligence functions, everybody today. So when you think about that, you know, let's go kind of back up to the top again and we'll dismount for today. What are some of those maybe main takeaways that you want our audience to be left with today, Lauren? You know, we covered a lot of ground. You know, again, the identify, collect, and analyze, and then implement, 3 stages. What are your kind of parting remarks for our audience today? I'll let you go first.
Great, thanks. I'd just like to thank everyone for being here and, you know, thanks Derek and Todd for engaging on this. I think that if anyone is to come away with a message from this, it's that benchmarking can be an important tool, but it's essential to dig into the deeper story. So there are going to be some, you know, publicly available or maybe industry association benchmarks, and those can be useful, but really paying attention to what's going to be important for your particular organization and your stakeholders is critical when engaging in benchmarking or any competitive intelligence or research activity.
Todd, you added a lot to our conversation today.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for being here. What would you say maybe would be the capstone thoughts?
So all I would leave you with is remember that public free data happens to be what's easy to record and is, you know, filled out or tabulated in the same process, but it probably is not what you really want to measure. If you had to redesign what you're actually trying to benchmark or trying to get and start from the ground up, you'd have a different indicator. And so usually what we find is that you have to start with that data. It's really useful to use. And then as you continue to pull on the string of like, well, why is that happening? You might have to use, you know, either human sources or other methods, some of the things that were shown. You're going to end up with a very different story. And that's really where your opportunity becomes clear. And there's a lot of money to be made in kind of peeling back the layers of that onion.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's excellent. I'm seeing about a minute to go. And I think there was a question out there. Are benchmarks based only on secondary sources? Are they reliable? They're reliable up to a point. I think, Todd, to your point here, easy to get in general. That's going to be the easier stuff if it's collected in a secondary realm. Reliable up to a point, but it probably is not going to be validated, or I like to use the term triangulated through more effective means using human intelligence. Again, so we are almost at time, everybody. I want to thank you again. I want to thank Lauren, Kenny. I want to thank Todd Tomalik. You both were amazing. Really, not just today, but just in the run up to this, the preparation phase for getting today together. I took a lot of joy in that, and it was fun to work with you. Looking out ahead, everybody, I've got another webinar coming up in March. It is on Thursday, March 14th. It's going to cover strategic probabilities and possible futures. So it's more of a wargaming competitive simulation angle. My good friend Tim Smith is going to be our play-by-play analyst, and a young lady out of the Minneapolis, St. Paul area by the name of Mary McCarthy, who has a pretty deep background in strategic exercises, wargaming, competitive sims, is going to join us in that color commentary role. So I hope you'll be able to join me in just over a month, March 14th, with Tim and Mary. And once again, Lauren, thank you. Todd, thank you. I hope everybody has a lovely rest of your day, rest of your week, and look forward to reaching out and having a chance to interact with you all in the near future. Thanks, everybody.
Great job, everyone. We are still live. I'm going to cut the social.